OK, well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to tell you today about some work that's joint with Ron Shorrer, who's guarding my seat over there. So let me start by motivating this project. I want to say that centralized markets often operate within a much broader economic context. And what I mean is that when we design these things, we're not designing from scratch. I think it's more natural to think of us as plopping a centralized market in the midst of an existing market that already has its own rules and institutions. And often it may be beyond our capabilities to rule out the old rules and institutions. And so I'm going to show you a framework in which it becomes very clear that one of the jobs of a well-designed centralized marketplace is to attract participants. And I think that's a natural way to think about many of the market designs that we think about all the time. So take kidney exchange, for instance. That's a market in which we now all know that hospitals often withhold their easiest-to-match patients and instead do internal transplants. In school choice, we now know that many charter schools opt not to participate in the centralized clearinghouse and instead recruit students decentrally. And so that's just to say that I think participation is important. It's an important margin, and it's not an entirely solved one. So in the framework I show you today, one of the salient features will be that the individual rationality constraint is endogenous. It will matter both who uses the centralized marketplace with you and also what they do. And so much like market designers look for dominant strategy incentive-compatible mechanisms, I'm going to show you a notion of dominant individual rationality. And it will, in many ways, analogously, guarantee that it's safe to participate in the centralized marketplace. So in the paper, we have a number of applications. Today, I'm going to highlight just one to a class of stable matching mechanisms that satisfy dominant individual rationality. And I hope at the end of my talk, you'll agree that not only do we offer some design guidance about how you might want to organize matching markets, but I'm also going to offer you a new non-cooperative justification for stability. OK, and we usually think about stability as a cooperative solution concept, so maybe that's a little bit unusual. Let me blast through related literature. There are a number of related papers and ideas, many by people in the audience. But let me highlight just two sub-literatures. One is the literature on mediators. And our framework is going to be very close to the framework on mediators, although our questions will be quite different. And the other literature that I want to highlight is an applied market design literature that asks, in particular contexts, is there an equilibrium in which everyone participates? And so I'll be instead showing you a relatively general framework, and I'll be asking for guarantees rather than merely the existence of an equilibrium. So let's jump into the model. I'm going to start with some game. It's a normal form game, gamma. It has players, actions, a type profile, a utility function, a common prior. Those all work in the usual way. And I want you to think of that as the decentralized game. That's the game that we have to take as given. We have to do our design around this game. And then we can introduce a mediator. And a mediator M is a pair of objects. It's a message space R, and it's a mapping from messages to outcomes. And I want to highlight two features about this mapping from messages to outcomes. The first is that in this setting, outcomes are action profiles. That is, if you choose to use the mediator, you're signing away your decision rights, and it can choose an action for you. And it will choose the action for you as a function of all of the other messages that it received from other participants. The other thing that I want to highlight is that the mediator is optional. So I need to design a different mapping for every possible coalition of players who signs away their decision rights. And that's why we index every mu with an S. S is for the coalition of players. So the special feature of this model is that players have the option to use the mediator, but they don't have to. They can keep their decision rights. And so let me be a little bit more specific about how that works. I've told you about a game gamma. I've told you about a mediator. When you combine those two things, you get a mediated game. That has the same players, the same type profile, and the same prior, but now it has an expanded action space. OK, so players can choose any of their old decentralized strategies. I haven't influenced those. But now they can also choose the centralized strategies, the strategies associated with the mediator. And payoffs are extended in the natural way. So if some players choose centralized strategies and others choose decentralized strategies, then their payoff will be the same as if they were playing in the old game. The decentralized strategies were the same. And now the players who chose centralized strategies instead choose the actions that the mediator would have chosen on their behalf. OK, hopefully that's natural. In words, how does this work? Well, players are simultaneously deciding whether or not to sign away their decision rights. You should think of that as the decision of whether or not to use the centralized marketplace. If you sign away your decision rights, you send a message to the mediator, which then chooses an action on your behalf as a function of all of the messages it received. And if you didn't choose a message, then you choose your own action in a decentralized manner. OK, and let me note that in the applications I talk about today, Ron and I will be thinking about mediators as a means of coordination. OK, that you submit your private information, perhaps your preferences, and it coordinates actions as a function of those preferences. But it's also worth highlighting that in this general framework, mediators can serve as a means of conditional commitment, that I can promise to do something if you make a similar promise. And that won't feature at all in this talk, but in the related literature, that's an important part of mediation. OK, so I think in many ways, this slide is the most important slide in the whole talk. This is our definition of dominant individual rationality. OK, and we're going to say that a mediator is dominant individually rational if for every player and every decentralized action AI that player has access to, there should be a corresponding centralized strategy, RAI, that weakly dominates it. Okay? That is, for every strategy profile that a player might follow, and for every type of player I, RAI, the centralized strategy, should do weakly better, and at least in one place strictly better. That's what it means to be dominant individually rational. Let me talk about what it doesn't mean. A dominant individually rational mechanism does not necessarily provide a dominant strategy for a player. It does not even necessarily provide a single centralized strategy which dominates all decentralized strategies. OK, so we have results in the paper that quite generally you can't get these latter two things. But nevertheless, I'd argue that dominant individual rationality is an attractive guarantee. Because from an ex-ante perspective, when you're thinking about what decentralized strategy you'll want to play, you'll always be convinced that there's a better centralized strategy. OK? So that's what I mean when I say we guarantee that it's safe to use the centralized mechanism. In the paper, we talk about an application to the Boston algorithm, and we show that some implementations of the Boston algorithm satisfy this condition. OK, but for today, I want to talk about another application. And to do that, I actually need to introduce an approximate notion of dominant individual rationality. And so we call it epsilon k delta dominant individual rationality. And we say that a mediator is epsilon k delta dominant individually rational if for all players and all decentralized actions, AI, there's a corresponding centralized strategy, RAI, that satisfies two properties. And the first is epsilon regret, that RAI should be never more than epsilon worse than AI. And I think that's the natural relaxation of dominant individual rationality. But on its own, it's not enough. And the reason is that there's a really stupid mediator that satisfies epsilon regret, which is the mediator that just replicates all decentralized strategies. OK, that doesn't seem like an attractive mediator. So we impose a second criterion, which we call k-delta attraction. And k-delta attraction says that if enough players use the centralized marketplace with certainty, RAI should be strictly better than AI. Formally, it says that if a fraction k of all players participates in the centralized mechanism irrespective of their type, then RAI should be at least delta better than AI. OK, and I think that's actually a pretty weak condition. You can think of these as strategy profiles in which the market is thick and in which it doesn't suffer from adverse selection because we require it to be type-independent participation. So not a terribly strong condition, but nevertheless, together these provide an attractive guarantee. If you use your centralized strategy, you will never be harmed by more than epsilon. And if enough other players also do it, then you'll be helped by delta. And in the application that I'm going to show you, epsilon will vanish as the market becomes large, but delta and k will be fixed. OK, so that's everything about the general framework. I hope that's all clear, because we're going to jump into the matching market application. And I'm going to use the framework of a more like a Median. And what I really need is a small core. So this will be a one-to-one matching market where I need everyone to have a unique stable match with high probability. And we're going to do that using the Morlika-Median framework. But I think we could have done this with the Szlagi-Knorr-Leshno framework as well. OK, so what's going on here? We have a one-to-one matching market. Players are divided into firms and workers. We have an equal number of each. Firms have random short preference lists, and workers have full preference lists, also random. And actually, let me also say, if this framework isn't familiar to you, then the next slide or two won't make a lot of sense. But I really hope and expect that the intuitions behind our results will not be sensitive to deeply understanding how the Morlika-Median framework works. So we have all this. I have to tell you about the decentralized game. OK, I have to tell you about the actions. And the action space in the decentralized game is going to be that firms are going to point to a worker. OK, and you should think of that as a job offer. And workers are going to choose a preference ordering, a rank order list. And that's going to determine whose offer they accept. Okay, so firms point to a worker sees all the offers it gets, and it picks the best one. And that's a stark model. What I want to highlight, though, is that there are gains from centralization, that this is a model with coordination frictions. Okay, so at the end of the decentralized game, there will be some firms that pointed to the same worker and some workers who didn't get any offers. And that's an inefficiency due to congestion or coordination. So let me say we can generalize this decentralized game substantially. In particular, we can have the decentralized game be either the deferred acceptance algorithm or the Boston algorithm with a finite number of offers. And you should think of this as the special case where that finite number is 1. OK, and I'm going to restrict attention to anonymous strategies. And these are strategies for which your action can depend on your utility, your preferences, but not on the identities of players. And I do that because we're going to need the core to be small for all strategy profiles. So in a Sloggy Canary Leshno and a Morlik and Maidian, we're talking about stability with respect to true preferences. Here, we're talking about stability with respect to stated preferences. And we need it to be small core everywhere. We do that with anonymity. OK, so that's the game. Now let me tell you about some mediators. And the first mediator I want to talk to you about is perhaps the first stable matching mediator you would try to implement in this context. And so the strategy space, the message space, will be the set of all preference orderings over the other side of the market. That's R. And the matching function, the outcome function, will be a stable matching function. So the mediator is going to see all the stated preferences. It's going to determine some stable outcome as a function of those preferences. It will assume that non-participants submitted an empty ordering. And importantly, it will then enforce the matching that it determined. Okay? So firms are going to be forced to make an offer to their assigned worker, and workers will be forced to accept it. Of course, they could also opt not to participate in the match. Okay, so that's the mediator. And what we can show is that there is a good equilibrium here where everyone participates and you achieve coordination. But it's not going to be epsilon k delta dominant IR for small epsilon. And the reasons are simple. You can have adverse selection kind of profiles where you worry that only bad partners are in the market. And you can have concerns about thickness. You can worry that there just won't be a lot of people in the market, and so that wouldn't be a good place to try to find a job. And I think that's not very surprising. But what I hope is a little bit surprising is that we can fix these problems. And so let me show you Ron and my suggestion, which we're calling the modified stable matching mediator. OK, so it's going to have the same message space. Firms and workers still submit preference orderings over the other side of the market. It's still going to find a stable matching, assuming that non-participants submitted an empty list. But then what it does is different. And the really special difference is that we're going to allow workers to accept any offer they get anywhere in the market. So perhaps they get a centralized offer and a decentralized offer. We're going to allow workers to look at both of those and pick whichever one's better. We won't be binding them to accept the offer they get through the match. The other difference is small, but worth highlighting, which is that we allow firms to condition their own participation on the entry of their first choice worker. So if I enter the market and I list Ron first, and it turns out that Ron didn't sign away his decision rights, he was acting decentrally, I have a chance to change my mind. But if Ron is in, then I'm bound to whatever assignment that's made for me. So I listed Ron first. He was in. I had the misfortune of being matched to Scott. I have to make Scott an offer. OK, no chuckles. I actually would find that fortunate. OK, so that's the mediator. And here's the theorem. This is a mediator that's epsilon k delta dominant IR, and epsilon will vanish as the market becomes large. Let me tell you a little bit about how we arrive at that result. For workers, this is easy. We've made it a dominant strategy for them to enter, right? A worker can decide whether he wants to enter or not, and by entering, he just gets more offers. He might get a centralized offer. Whatever decentralized offers he would have gotten, he still gets them. So for a worker, this is easy. The special thing is for firms. And to understand why this is dominant IR for a firm, we're going to think about two strategies. The decentralized strategy is called AW. It's to point to worker W, make him a decentralized offer. And the centralized strategy will be to submit any preference ordering to the centralized market, but to list worker W first. Okay, and I argue that the centralized strategy will approximately dominate the decentralized strategy. Let me tell you why. We're going to do this by partitioning the states of the world into two sets. First, suppose that worker W would have rejected firm F decentrally. OK? Well, that's the state of the world in which you're very happy you used the centralized marketplace. Because there's some chance the centralized marketplace won't have you waste your offer on worker W. That's why we use centralization, right? We can coordinate. I know I can't get worker W. I'll make an offer to someone else. So clearly, the centralized strategy is better in that case. How about if instead I could have gotten worker W decentrally? Okay, she would have accepted my offer. Well, I claim if I list her first, then I'm going to get her with very high probability in a centralized marketplace as well, because it's stable. Okay, so importantly, if worker W would have accepted my offer decentrally, she likes me better than the other decentralized offer she got and the other centralized offer she got. And now I enter and I list her first. So she and I form a blocking pair to any tentative matching that tries to put her with her previous stable match. That's not a guarantee that I get her, but if she had a unique stable match in the previous market, then it is a guarantee. And that's what we use for the large core. Okay, so there's some chance that I get messed up, but it becomes arbitrarily unlikely as the market becomes large. So just to recap, what have I shown you? I've shown you that every decentralized strategy is approximately dominated by some centralized strategy. And I can't tell you exactly what people will do in the centralized marketplace, but I can offer you a reasonable assurance that people will use the centralized marketplace. And for markets that coordinate actions, perhaps participation is a lot of the battle. OK, so let me try to wrap up here. A few comments about the mediator I just described to you. One is that it resembles relatively closely a suggestion that Muriel Niederle and Al Roth made when thinking about how to redesign the market for gastroenterologists. Okay, so they suggested that gastroenterologists looking for fellowships should be allowed to recruit any decentralized offer that they can find, and then they can still participate in the centralized mechanism afterwards, evaluate their offer, and take the best one. And that should look highly analogous to what I just showed you. We don't have timing in our model, but otherwise the suggestion is very close. And in their paper, they understood that this would make it very attractive for workers to participate. But they take for granted that the firms will follow suit. And our model highlights stability's role in that calculation, right? If this had, instead of being stability, it had been some implementations of Boston, or if it had been rank sum, it's not true that firms would be interested in following suit. And intuitively, that's because those are algorithms that prioritize workers who rank a firm highly, irrespective of how a firm ranks that worker. So maybe I could have gotten Ron decentrally. I enter the market and I list him first, but Scott listed me first. And so I get matched to Scott even though I had prioritized Ron. OK, so stability is important here. I hope that you agree that dominant individual rationality illuminates some of its role there. And to the extent that stability was important, that's also a non-cooperative justification for stability, right? Because this is a non-cooperative model. Stability helped us achieve this nice property. So let me wrap up. I think this model illuminates some of the differences between market design and mechanism design. In mechanism design, we assume that we can create the entire game, and we ask what outcomes can we achieve given full participation. And I think that's abstracting from some of the very important features of real market design, including this margin of participation. Ron likes to end talks by saying that, while we think we've uncovered some interesting issues here, this may not be the right model to actually understand them. And so while we're sure that this is an important area of study, we're not sure we've solved it. We see a lot of room for improvement. And so hopefully next EC we'll learn something new about participation in markets. Thank you.